Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we will be discussing the external features of brainstem. Brainstem includes the medulla, pons, and midbrain. As such, the anatomy of the brainstem should include both the external features and internal features. But as far as the various university syllabuses are concerned, there is a variation between the medical and dental streams. The syllabus of medical stream includes both the external and internal features, whereas for dental students, it is sufficient to know only the external features. So what we will do, we will be discussing the external features which is common for both MBBS and BDS students in this video. And we will discuss the internal features in some other video sometime later. Okay, as I told you, the brainstem includes the medulla, pons, and midbrain. Midbrain continues upwards as forebrain, and the medulla continues downwards as the spinal cord. So the brainstem includes from below upwards the medulla, pons, and midbrain. We will see each of the structure separately, but before that, as usual, let's do our diagram. Okay, coming back, let's see our medulla first. Medulla lies between the pons above and spinal cord below. It lies in the anterior part of posterior cranial fossa. Anteriorly, it is related to the clivus, the sloping portion in front of the foramen magnum, part of the occipital bone, that is called clivus. You might be knowing that already. Okay, anteriorly, it is related to the clivus, whereas posteriorly, it is related to the vallicula of cerebellum. The medulla is divided into an open part or superior part and closed or inferior part. Medulla has a cavity within it which is continuation of the central canal of the spinal cord. But as we move upwards, this cavity moves dorsally, opening up to form part of the fourth ventricle. Part of medulla where this cavity is open and forms part of the fourth ventricle is called the open or superior part, and part of the medulla which has a closed cavity which is continuous downwards with the central canal of spinal cord is called the closed part. Moving on to the external features proper, the medulla is divided into two halves by anterior and posterior median fissure. Okay. There is an anterior median fissure and a posterior median fissure which divides the medulla into two equal halves. The anterior median fissure ends in foramen cecum. Each half is further divided into anterior, lateral and posterior regions by two sulci, anterolateral and posterolateral sulci. So the medulla is divided into two halves by anterior and posterior median fissure, and each half is further divided into three parts, the anterior, lateral and posterior parts by anterolateral and posterolateral sulci. Coming to the external features of anterior surface, there is a longitudinal elevation formed by corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts called the pyramid. Okay. This longitudinal elevation here is called the pyramid, and it is formed by the corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts. Corticospinal or tracts running from cortex to the spinal cord, and corticobulbar or tracts running from the cerebral cortex to the medulla oblongata. Medulla is another name called bulb because it resembles the shape of a bulb. So medulla is otherwise called bulb. So tracts running from cerebral cortex to the medulla, mostly to the cranial nerve nuclei in the medulla, are called corticobulbar tracts. So this corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tracts together form a longitudinal elevation in the anterior surface of medulla, which is called the pyramid. The fibers of this pyramid, about 75%, okay, about 75% of the fibers of this pyramid cross over to the opposite side in the lower part, and this is called the pyramidal decussation. Lateral to the pyramid, there is an oval elevation called the olive, which is formed by the inferior olivary nucleus. So lateral to the pyramid, there is another elevation which is oval in shape and called the olive, and it is formed by the inferior olivary nucleus. Coming to the posterior surface, the upper part is V-shaped and forms the floor of the fourth ventricle. The floor of the fourth ventricle presents a few features like a facial colliculus, but we will discuss that separately in a separate video because the floor of the fourth ventricle in itself is a separate topic, and we will discuss the features of the floor of the fourth ventricle separately in a separate video. For the time being, know that the upper part of the medulla, that is the posterior surface of the medulla, is V-shaped and forms the floor of the fourth ventricle. Below the floor of the fourth ventricle, there are three longitudinal elevations medial to lateral, named as fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus and inferior cerebellar peduncle. three longitudinal elevations in the lower part from medial to lateral, fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, and inferior cerebellar peduncle. The upper end of fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus forms the gracile and cuneate tubercle, which contains nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. Lateral to cuneate tubercle is the tuber cinereum, underneath which lies the spinal nucleus of fifth nerve, that is the trigeminal nerve. Coming to the arterial supply, the medulla is supplied by vertebral artery, anterior and posterior spinal arteries, anterior and posterior inferior cerebellar arteries, and branches of basilar artery. Coming to the clinical anatomy, the medulla contains the vital centers, that is the centers responsible for respiration, vasomotor action, etc. And so any injury to the lower part of medulla is usually fatal. Any injury to the lower part of medulla which contains the vital centers, that is the centers for respiration, vasomotor action, etc. is usually fatal. Coming to pons. Pons means bridge, and it is given such a name because it acts as a bridge between the two cerebellar hemispheres. The pons is continuous laterally with the middle cerebellar peduncle and thereby looks like a bridge between the two cerebellar hemispheres. So it is given the name pons, which means bridge. This pons lies between the midbrain above and medulla below. Anteriorly, it is related to the clivus. Laterally, as I told you, it is continuous as middle cerebellar peduncle, and posteriorly, it is related to the fourth ventricle. Coming to the external features, the features of the ventral or anterior surface. The anterior surface of the pons is convex and it is transversely striated. At the median plane, there is a vertical sulcus called the basilar sulcus, which contains the basilar artery. Median plane presents a sulcus, basilar sulcus, which lodges the basilar artery. Laterally, as I told you, it is continuous with the middle cerebellar peduncle. Coming to the posterior surface or dorsal surface, it forms the upper half of the floor of the fourth ventricle. As you saw, the lower half is formed by the medulla and the upper half of the floor of the fourth ventricle is formed by the posterior surface of the pons. As I told you, the features of the floor of the fourth ventricle we will see in a separate topic dealing with fourth ventricle. Moving on to the arterial supply, the pons is supplied by the pontine branches of basilar artery and anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Moving on to midbrain. Midbrain lies between the forebrain and pons, and this midbrain passes through the tentorial notch of tentorium cerebelli. Coming to the features on the ventral surface, the ventral surface of midbrain presents the crus cerebri or the cerebral peduncle. crus cerebri here is crossed by the optic tract. Medial to the crus lies the oculomotor nerve and lateral to it lies the trochlear nerve. The dorsal surface of the midbrain presents four bulgings, a pair of superior and inferior colliculi together called the corpora quadrigemina. Coming to the relations of the midbrain, as we saw, on each side it is related to the optic tracts and trochlear nerve. Anteriorly, it is related to the interpedunclar structures, that is the structures between the two cerebral peduncles, the interpedunclar structures, including the mammillary bodies, tuberous cinerarium, etc. The interpeduncular structures is a separate topic. We will deal that in some other video. For the time being, remember our midbrain is related anteriorly to the interpeduncular structures. Posteriorly, it is related to the splenium of corpus callosum. That is the posterior part of corpus callosum called the splenium. The pineal body, the posterior ends of right and left thalami. Moving on to the arterial supply, the midbrain is supplied by branches from basilar artery, posterior cerebral artery, superior cerebellar artery, posterior communicating artery, and anterior choroidal artery. Any study of brainstem is incomplete without seeing the relation of the various cranial nerves to the brainstem. The relation or the point of emergence of the various cranial nerves and the brainstem. The olfactory nerve, that is the first nerve, the olfactory nerve is not related to the brainstem. The second nerve, the optic, is also not related to the brainstem, though as we saw earlier, the optic tract is related to the lateral side of the midbrain. But all other nerves down from the third nerve is closely related to the brainstem and they emerge from the brainstem. The third nerve or oculomotor nerve emerges from the ventral aspect of the midbrain and is related to the medial aspect of crus cerebri, and the fourth nerve emerges from the dorsal aspect and is related to the lateral part of crus cerebri. So remember, the third nerve emerges from the ventral aspect of the midbrain related to the medial surface of crus cerebri. The fourth nerve emerges from the dorsal aspect of the midbrain related to the lateral surface of crus cerebri. The fifth nerve or trigeminal nerve emerges from the ventral aspect of pons at the junction between the pons and middle cerebellar peduncle. The fifth nerve emerges from the ventral aspect of pons right at the junction between the pons and the middle cerebellar peduncle. The 6, 7 and 8, the abducent, facial and vestibulocochlear nerves emerge from the pontomedullary junction, the junction between the pons and medulla. The 6th, 7th and 8th nerve emerges from the pontomedullary junction in order from medial to lateral. The 9th, 10th and 11th nerve that is the glossopharyngeal, vagus and accessory nerves, emerge from the posterolateral sulci of medulla. Remember here the posterolateral sulci comes first, not the anterolateral. The posterolateral sulci comes first. So the 9th, 10th and 11th nerves emerge in order from above downwards. The 9th nerve is topmost. Okay, emerge in order from above downwards from the posterolateral sulci of the medulla. And the final nerve, that is the 12th nerve, hypoglossal nerve, emerges from the anterolateral sulci of medulla. So remember, the third nerve or the oculomotor nerve emerges from the ventral aspect of midbrain, and the fourth nerve, the trochlear nerve, emerges from the dorsal aspect of midbrain. Remember, trochlear is the only nerve to emerge from the dorsal aspect. The fifth nerve emerges from the ventral aspect of pons, right at the junction between pons and middle cerebellar peduncle. The 6th, 7th and 8th abducen, facial and vestibulocochlear emerges from the pontomedullary junction. The 9, 10 and 11, that is the glossopharyngeal, vagus and accessory, emerge from the posterolateral sulci, and the 12th emerges from the anterolateral sulci of medulla. With this, we will end this session. If you like my class, do hit the like button. For more such class videos, keep the channel subscribed. The PDF notes, as usual, are available in the link provided in the description. For live online classes and guidance, contact the mail ID provided in the description. Thanks for watching.